Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War Frontline update for the 4th of July 2024. 4th of July! As everyone knows around the world, 4th of July is UK election day. So happy voting, happy UK election day. Something else happened. Something else happened on 4th of July. Oh, it's not important. Anyway, if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen, the key on this screen at the moment. Let's go to the front line. Oh, okay. Happy Independence Day. Let's go to the front line, and there is some very interesting activity on the northern front. There are lots of pins on the map today because this is a 2-day update. I didn't get a chance to do the update yesterday, so I do apologise for that. There is therefore more activity than you would normally see. Okay, but there's also a lot of activity, and I think Russians are really putting the pressure on to try and get, I think, something achieved, in this summer attack period. We have a new axis or a new sector that's opened up. Why this is significant, in and of itself, it's like, okay, so I haven't been able to put the polygon here, but essentially, this is what has happened. So the Russians have taken some new territory. Syriac map says, during the last 3 hours, the Russian army managed to capture the border locality at Sotnitsky, Kozachok, opening a third axis in Kharkiv Oblast. Okay, why this is really significant. And I'm not sure the rationale here for Russia, because they know that the US has just recently said, if the front line expands, up in the Kharkiv area, if the front line expands, then Ukraine can strike more than 100 kilometers into Russian territory. That's how I understood the slight give on the restrictions for, say, striking Russian airfields. Now, we have seen Russia strike 3 airfields in 3 consecutive days. Another strike took place today. It was thought to be an airfield, I think in Poltava, but it's actually a oil refinery. We are seeing Russia, I think, start to pick up, maybe learn from the Ukrainians in how to do systematic targeting of decent either military or infrastructural objectives. Russians have, throughout the course of the war, just thrown a load of missiles all over the place. They have had some great success. They've taken out energy infrastructure. But too often we've seen missiles hammer into Dnipro and residential areas. For example, just in the last few days. Now we have also seen a number of consecutive strikes on really high value targets, military targets, and now an infrastructural target. So that could be a little bit of a change for the Russians. Ukrainians desperately need to be able to hit these air bases that sit a little bit behind the border areas into Russia. I don't know. I think Engels is possibly going to be too far. So Saratov up here. How far is that from? Yeah, that's way too far. So that's sort of 660. But there are a number of air bases sit just behind the border areas inside Russia. And this third sector of attack in the Kharkiv Oblast could give Ukraine the permission they need to go hammer and tongs at the Russians. I hope it does. Okay, so we can see that there's a small area here that the Russians have taken control of just over the border. When we go over to the Litsy area just north of Kharkiv, the Russians have maybe taken a little bit of land back in the Hlyobike area. That could be significant there because the Ukrainians were supposed to be pushing the Russians, flushing them out of Hlyobike, and it could signify that there is some kind of counter attack by the Russians. Indeed, Syriac Maps has all the colours slightly different now. I changed that and it hasn't updated yet. But yeah, that the Russians have maybe pushed back a little bit by the Tversky Donetsk river here. Goodness me, that's come a long way from where we see it. Tversky Donetsk down here. So anyway, there you go. That's another part of the river up there. So the Russians pushing back, but Ukrainians, on the other hand, pushing the Russians back a little bit in one of the streets just north of the aggregates plant in the middle of Vovchansk, according to Syriac Maps. No other mapper has any changes to the Kharkiv sectors only Surat maps there. So a lot of activity going on. The Russians could be putting the pressure on. I think they've got a bit of an element of the sunk cost fallacy there, where they have taken a bit of a hiding in this area. They've lost an awful lot of men and material. And you've got General Lapin, the commander of the area, thinking, okay, I didn't have a very good reputation before here. I've got to make my reputation in Kharkiv. It's gone so wrong. He either gets out, cuts his losses, but then definitely looks a failure, or he tries to chase good money or bad money with good money and overcome the deficit there. And I'm not sure it's going to work, but maybe opening up another sector is the key for Russian success there, he might think. Who knows? We shall see. Right, when we come down to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna, you can see there are a few little places of Ukrainian gain up here, which is nothing we have particularly seen for some time. This is around the Kislivka, Kotelyrivka area. Interesting, Tabaivka there, the Russians being hemmed in there, pushed back a little bit, and a tiny bit just north of Novoselivska as well in this tiny area there. That's somewhat unexpected, but good news. I don't know if that's a rejigging of Surat maps or that is a counter attack in that area. It's interesting that in the Novoherivka area, so that is a little bit further to. Is that not? No, that is in the is it not in that area? No, actually it's down here. Ryarodka area, isn't it? Here. So this is where Novoherivka is. There it is, Novoherivka. So no changes to the mappers there, but I've got a sort of, not weird, but a bit of an outlier here of Defmon saying one of the most capable units when it comes to trench warfare. 3rd Assault Brigade seem to have advanced around 2 kilometers according to my map, and that's in the Novoherivka area, going from going from here all the way over to there. But then, of course, that's what we already have on the map, so no changes there. But this could all be grey zone. It could be that the Ukrainians have actually pushed to that position down that tree line, that kind of river area, which would be just here. So you might have Ukrainians much further to the east than had previously been suggested. So there could be some Ukrainian activity there as well to their favour. Okay, so that's some good news for the Ukrainians in that area. Then we get on to some challenging news around this, goodness me, quite a lot of the front here, south of Novovodyanye here, Makivka area. All the mappers suggesting there are some gains, possibly, well, the northern gains seem to be what's happened over the last 24 hours, and then Andrew Perpetua may be catching up further to the south in gains that the other mappers have previously observed. Right, okay, if we come down to Surat maps here, so this is the area we're talking about now. Over the last 48 hours, Russian army increased the pressure over the locality of Makivka by advancing from the north along the Zherebets River. So lots of activity there. No change to the Terny and Torska area, or indeed to the Serebyansky forest, although this is an area where the Ukrainians have had some success as well over the last few weeks, and I think they're still pushing the Russians, including in the Serebyansky forest, as mentioned. So no change to anywhere around Bilahorivka. Some slight changes here, but they were older ones, just not registered. Just a rejig on our account, south of Spion on the way to Viimka. But anyway, the main, I guess one of the main bits of news today comes from the Canal micro-district to the east of Chasiv Yar across this canal. So the canal there, in fact, I need to make sure I have my layers on. Yeah. So the canal comes down here, and the Russians have been slowly grinding forward. But I guess the more of the canal micro-district they took, the less tenable, the more untenable it came for the Ukrainians to control it. The Russians would have to supply it. Sorry, the Russians would have fire control over the Ukrainians getting across the canal to supply their own troops. So at some point, you've got to say, right, cut our losses and let's use the canal as a decent defensive line. So this is bad news for the Ukrainians by point of fact that they have lost the canal micro-district. And all the mappers seem to agree with that Surat Maps has much more charitable understanding of where the Russians control north of this area, in the forest area between Kalinivka and indeed in Kalinivka and the Canal Microdistrict. But yeah, so I just want to read you what I read this morning, Andrew Perpetua's synopsis of this and other gains for the Russians, because we must get this in context. And what I'm going to do is say, yep, they have lost that. Chasiv Yar was claimed to be, it would be lost by sometime in the summer. The most charitable understanding for the Ukrainians would be to lose it by the end of the summer. But actually, they're looking pretty good at the moment. Pretty good. It's tough. It's horrible. It's horrific. Both sides are losing a lot, but the Ukrainians have done an amazing job to hold on to it for as long as they have, right? Now, if we zoom out here and we get a sense of how big Ukraine is and how many losses the Russians are taking in terms of personnel and materiel. Because of the Kharkiv area, Zelensky has said, and take that with a pinch of salt because he is the leader of the Ukrainian forces, there's going to be a lot of PR involved. But he's saying that the Russians are losing 6-to-1 ratio, Russians to Ukrainians. It was 4-to-1, but since they attacked up here, they are now losing 6-to-1. That's how problematic this area has been for the Russians. That's, again, according to Zelensky. But when we come back down to Chasiv Yar, Andrew Perpetua says, look, okay, yeah, they're grinding on, but let's get some perspective here. And he says, I'm frankly 0% concerned with any Russian advance going on currently. They are using all of their resources to push these attacks. This is what I'm saying. They're trying to make hay while the sun shines, almost quite literally. They are trying to, while the sun is good, while the ground is hard, while the summer is there, they're trying to get those advances in before they run out of troops, run out of material, and run out of good weather. So they are using all of their resources to push these attacks, burning through supplies that will permanently weaken Russia as a result. All of the advances they are making are ultimately minor and were predicted to happen. Nothing going on is outside of what was expected. In fact, if anything, the Russian timeline is dramatically behind that even my most pessimistic view of what Russia was capable of. And it makes me wonder if I have been overestimating them. I thought they would have captured Canal by the beginning of June and would be assaulting Chasiv Yar proper for a month now. Of course, they're not there. But they've only recently been able to capture Canal. I thought they would have pushed to the highway north of Ocheritina by now. And let's just get a sense of where that is. Sorry to flip around, but he said, I thought they'd be at this highway northwest of Ocheritina, which is just there. And we have the Avdiivka salient there. So he thought they'd be there by now, and they're simply not. But their advance north has slowed to a crawl, and instead they started moving west. I thought they would advance parallel to New York on the west and be attacking Toretsk from the south, but instead they are moving through Pavichne and only now are entering New York. And most of all, I never in a million years would have believed Ukraine would stop Russia in Pobyeda. So that is to say that up here they are moving here, but he thought they'd be further along there. And also that Russia had been essentially stopped at Pobyeda. So Pobyeda is a small agricultural settlement that Russia took an incredibly long time to take. The Ukrainians held on to there for an awful long time to stop this flanking move around Mariinka. So the idea that the Russians would have been stopped at that tiny little place for as long as they have is quite frankly incredible. So yes, this isn't cope. This is like the Russians are empirically, visually evidenced losing a tremendous amount of equipment and personnel. That is absolutely what is happening. Now, the Ukrainians might be losing a lot as well, but I doubt they are to the degree the Russians are. The drone usage of the Ukrainians still has that advantage. Go and check out my live stream the other night with the Tochny guys, Daniela and Erland. The Ukrainians are using drones. They're using more drones. They're using them better, and they're using better drones in terms of the FPV and IED dropping drones, and nighttime vision drones as well as now overtaking the Russians. So on the battlefront, it is exceptionally difficult for the Russians. They are losing a lot of stuff, and that is a permanent thing for them. Where the West, luckily for Ukraine, we can keep hopefully keep providing infantry fighting vehicles and tanks, and indeed. We are setting up manufacturing facilities inside Ukraine to provide Lynx and Fuchs, both IFVs and APCs, and they're producing their own as well, right? Russia are at the moment operating at their max, and they are absolutely chomping through their equipment to the point that stockpiles are now getting depleted. They're using golf carts and quads and motorcycles and tracked garden sheds on the front line. So things are difficult for the Russians, and their only kind of sense of gaining stuff is just throwing people, more and more infantry assaults, which is what we're seeing up in the north. There are multiple accounts that they are primarily infantry led, and elsewhere along the front line it is infantry led or using motorcycles and golf buggies and whatnot. So this looks bad on the map. There are lots of pins, and it's challenging. These places get destroyed and Ukrainian soldiers are dying, but it comes at a tremendous cost for the Russians, and that much seems to be the case. So Christopher Miller here says from the Financial Times, Ukrainian forces had withdrawn from parts of the long-fought eastern city of Chasiv Yar, highlighting the challenge facing Kyiv's troops as Russia intensifies its offensive and US military aid is slow to arrive. Indeed, that's something that Zelensky was very public about, how aid is getting too slowly to Ukraine. Ukrainian army spokesman said holding the canal district of Chasiv Yar became impractical. The army retreated after the enemy entered it because it threatened the lives and health of our servicemen, and the positions of our defenders were destroyed. This is interesting that was it Erland saying the other night that, or it might have been Daniela actually, saying that actually Syrskyi, although he had the reputation as being a bit of a butcher, the guy in charge of the Ukrainians, he appears to be ceding territory when it becomes untenable rather than just holding on for dear hope and sacrificing too many Ukrainian lives. Like, the metric of success for the Ukrainians at the moment is not territory. That is for the Russians, but they don't have a metric of success of not losing troops, the Russians. So they measure their success in territory. The Ukrainians measure their success in attrition and troops. So you might look at somewhere like Chasiv Yar and say the Russians would say this is a success, and the Ukrainians can say, yeah, we've lost ground, but that's been a success for us. Exactly like Bakhmut worked. So I said Bakhmut was a success for the Ukrainians. They lost that, and it was horrific, and they actually lost an awful lot of people, the Ukrainians. But the number of troops that the Russians lost were pretty phenomenal, and it was the end of Wagner, and that precipitated the end of Prigozhin as a human being living on this earth, right? That was what Bakhmut did. And so I think in hindsight, that was a success, and I stand by that. You can look at Chasiv Yar and say, actually, the Ukrainians are successfully attriting the Russians as the Russians move forward and take ground. Okay, moving on. We have some further Russian success coming further to the south around Pivichnyi in the New York area. In fact, New York is further to south. Sorry, this is in the Touretsk area. So some more gains there for... let's see where we are going with this. It is, yeah, that's Canal Micro District, which I didn't tell you about, but you know that Surrey Maps is obviously going to say, look, taking that area. So now here we are. So the Russian army is continuing to advance inside Pivichnyi, taking control over the first houses of Horodok neighborhood and the first high buildings in the central micro district. So taking on some of these higher buildings in this area there. So that's where Surrey Maps is talking about, and that will then give them sight over some of the other areas of the settlement, although the Ukrainians should be in control of these buildings, you would have thought, and would be sighting over there. But there's going to be a lot of aviation hammering down and trying to knock down those buildings. So these guided glide bombs are going to be freely used around that area. And then we come further to the south, and the Russians have made some fairly significant gains in that area. So here we have... over the last 4 days, the Russian army penetrated Ukrainian defences south of New York, taking control over 25% of the town, plus the adjacent locality of Yurivka and some 2014 trenches to the east. On the other hand, Russian forces managed to seize a number of strongholds in Pivichnyi and entered the streets of Polova, Sudova and Zalizhnchina in the adjacent town of Druzhba. Okay, so there we have some further gains for the Russians as well, and yeah, this is definitely a challenge. Indeed, so, No Reports talks about those gains around Druzhba. Newly geolocated footage confirms Russian advances along the railway tracks towards Druzhba. Russians have increased their pace and amount of attacks in this area. So that is along the railway line towards Druzhba from Mayorsk here. They are just, pressuring in all of these areas. So this is a worry because Toretsk is a much more densely populated area. New York, Druzhba, Toretsk. There's a bit of a connection of these towns here, and that's going to be just an absolute shame from a civilian point of view. But it also puts a lot of stress on Konstantinivka because you've got Chasiv Yar up here, and gains down here in Konstantinivka then becomes somewhat vulnerable, and you've got Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk. These are heavily defended areas, but it's a worry for the Ukrainians. The question is, how much longer can, and I've said this for a long time, you might say, well, obviously much longer, because you've been saying that for 6 months, but how much longer can the Russians keep doing this? Especially when we are seeing the type of troops they're throwing into these meat assaults, the type of equipment they're using. Are we getting to the point where genuinely, because I've already said it's been unsustainable Russian losses to the point where they can't keep doing that and providing their troops with the best tanks and the best APCs and the best IFVs and the best trained troops as well. So we've got to a point we've got less well-trained troops with supposedly with injuries often. We've got much worse equipment being used, and that's how they're attacking, but they have the numerical advantage. And around here, the Ukrainians apparently were rotating possibly 2 units at the same time, and the Russians took great advantage of that, and hence some pretty good successes for the Russians there. So definitely challenging for the Ukrainians in this area. Even though I've painted a somewhat positive picture over the state of affairs for the Russians. Okay, when we come to the Avdiivka area, and this is kind of what Andrew Perpetual is talking about, they're struggling to move to the northwest towards the T0504 highway to interdict it there, but they are continuing to grind on moving westwards here. And from Ocheritina, you can see they're moving towards Prokhrez here, and a couple of the mappers, Deep State map for a little bit of a gain for the Russians, and Surat maps are quite substantial gains. They were sort of a bit all over the place. They've now in terms of, they've equalized somewhat the front line in that area. If we have a look at, so I think there are 2 changes here because there's been 2 days. We've got the earlier one that Surya Maps said the trench system north of Yevhenivka has been taken by the Russians, and they're continuing advancing along the railway towards Prokhrez. So that is this area that was initially taken. Advancing along that railway towards this Prokhrez settlement. And then they added this onto that, so some much greater gains there. The Russian army began advancing towards Lozovatske and took full control over Voskhod and developing the flanking of Novoselivska Persia from the north. Okay, that is to say that they've taken control over a settlement, Sokil here, and then Voskhod here. And that they are north of Yevhenivka, trench lines around here that they're taken on the way to the settlements and sort of surrounding Yevhenivka. So that is, I haven't got this noted on the map though, so I might have just missed out some gains that could have taken place just there. Sorry about that one, but they're moving towards Lozovatske in this direction too. So widespread attacks continuing and grinding their gains out as they move west towards Pokrovsk over here. Okay, then when we come down to Karlivka, some further gains for the Russians here as they move north of the reservoir, and they are starting to take this land in the middle. As again, according to Surat maps though, slight gains according to Deep State map, but this area where I said it's going to be interesting to see what they do here because they can be attacked. It's a bit of a funnel from all sides, and I thought that they would try and take the land further to the north there and further to the south rather than sit in there and invite themselves to be hit by mortars and artillery. But nonetheless, they are making the gains in that area between these water features, so that's happening there. just seeing if that, yeah, no, we're now going on to Krasnohorivka. So moving on to south, so just to remind you where we are, we've done Chasiv Yar, we have done New York and Toretsk, we have done the Avdiivka, northern Avdiivka salient really towards the highway, Ocheritina, the southern one around Karlivka, and now we are going into Krasnohorivka here, just north of Mariinka. And this is quite a large town compared to some of the places we're seeing fighting at the moment. And the Russians are making gains right through the main urban area there, as according to Surrey maps, and Andrew Perpetua has them making gains on the western outskirts of the town. As Surrey map says here, the situation in Krasnohorivka, the Russians took full control over the private district at the centre of Krasnohorivka, and troops are approaching to Nakimova Street. Anyway, you get the picture. They are making these gains within the town that are fairly significant. That's a good couple of days of gains for the Russians there. It's kind of a bit, it stops and starts in Krasnohorivka. As you can imagine, it's tough urban fighting there. Right, no change to Horivka and the Mariinka area, no change to Novomikhailivka, but quite a bit of change down here, not too far from the mines in the Vuhledar direction, Mikilska, where the Russians, all the mappers conclude that the Russians have made these gains in that corner of the Donetsk front line. Russian army made significant advances northwest of Volodymyrivka, says Surrey maps, reaching positions 3 kilometers from the road towards Vuhledar. Now, what we were talking about some time ago is that the attacks around Novomikhailivka would be super important because they want to take Konstantinivka, and that gives them the purchase on this highway that comes down to Vuhledar. Now, this is on higher ground. They tried to attack Vuhledar a number of times from the south through Pavlivka and Mikilska, and they failed. They got absolutely hammered because this is on higher ground, and you get a good sighting of the ground below. So if you remember, Vuhledar has these high-rise buildings that look down. So these high-rise buildings, although they've now been absolutely hammered by aviation, you do get to look down at the Russians below there, and you hit them with your ATGMs down here, and you get your artillery's been really effective. And they also heavily mine this with ram shells, dropping mines from artillery shells, as well as having sappers, I think, do it, and probably UGVs these days, unmanned ground vehicles. So the Russians were looking uphill, and although it doesn't look that significant, it really is. It makes a heck of a difference. And this area has just been, a graveyard of equipment for the Russians a number of times, and they kept trying to do the same thing over and over and expected a different result, and they burnt through 100 vehicles in one set of attacks there, and then tried it again. You had the 144th Naval Infantry Brigade. You got Marines down there who have been hammered and reconstituted a number of times and really aren't the elite troops that they were. They're not operating there now. Anyway, it's a bit of a disaster. So the idea was, right, they need to come up from Novomikhailivka and come down on the higher ground. But this is a ground to halt up in Novomikhailivka. They lost 320 vehicles. They've lost a lot of troops, and it's been pretty horrific there. I mean, yes, they took Novomikhailivka. This is one of the examples, like I talked about earlier, where the Russians succeeded in taking territory, but failed in getting absolutely hammered. The Ukrainians, yes, it was tough for them, but they absolutely hammered the Russian materiel around this area, and that meant that Konstantinivka is another bite of the apple that would cost the Russians an awful lot. So perhaps they're thinking, right, rather than try up there, let's advance down further to the south. Yeah, we're not going to go up from the south to Vuhledar, but if we can get to the mines up here and come down, get onto that road further to the north, then this might be a much more localized way of taking Vuhledar, which then allows them to take, it's the key to this kind of whole area here. So the Russians are definitely trying really hard in this area, and they've had some good success over the last few days. That's a little bit of a worry, really, as far as I'm concerned there. Okay, then some slight gains for the Russians around Staromylska, just north of Staromylska in the Velika Novosilka area. I don't know that that is... No, it's not discussed. They don't have a tweet for that, but they made some small gains. And then a couple of Ukrainian gains here. So one is in the Robotyne area, just around Novopokrovka, where the Russians have been pushed back there. Remember, you've got Novopokrovka and you've got Novopokrovka down here, those two, and Robotyne itself. We've seen the Russians expand their control, or at least Suret Maps has claimed that. The other mappers do not agree and call that a grey area still. But if the Ukrainians are pushing here, that could give the Russians something to think about, unless it is just a rejigging with some evidence that's come through. But also Piatikhatki, this area further to the west on the way to the reservoir at Kamyanska, we have the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Ukrainians in their counterattack stalled here. They started making some gains and then it became really difficult. The Russians were dug in, had trenches around Zherobianki, and it became positional. And you can see the white line is the May the 30th. So this is what the Ukrainians took in their counter-offensive. But they kind of ground to a halt there. They weirdly had some more gains here much, much later. But there's been no change here for ages. It's been pretty positional. Well, situation north of no, not there. That's okay. Situation on the Zaporizhzhia front, map modifications were made west of Piatikhatki, showing Ukrainian control in those positions. So might not be an attack. It could just be a rejigging now that there's evidence that maybe the Russians have been shelling this area. And he's seen evidence that that is the case. But actually, what it does is it just shows that Andrew Perpetua was right in that area anyway. And we don't have deep state mapping there, too many lines. But yeah, Andrew Perpetua is probably right. And Suret Maps finding evidence to suggest that the line needed rejigging. No changes to the Dnipro front line, and that's pretty much that. Hopefully that was of use and interesting. There's a lot of information there, a lot of changes to the mapping, and I haven't even gone through the Institute for the Study of War and got granular detail of that. It's just top of my head type stuff. But yeah, it is. There are worrying moves there. The Russians are grinding on, but the costs are really high for them. How long can they keep doing that? Right, thanks for watching. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.